Thanks everyone for joining us this morning for our webinar, EV Charging, Working with Your Strata Council. My name is Wendy Wall. I'm the president of the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association. And this is our fifth webinar in a series all about EV charging in stratas. First of all, I'd like to say on behalf of VISOA, to take a moment to say how grateful we are to the Lekwungen, Malahat, Chianu, Tasak, and Wasanich peoples whose territories we live and work. So this fall, VISOA reached out to strata owners that we met at our EV charging workshops back in 2019 and 20. And we wanted to check in with them and see if they had proceeded with installing EV infrastructure in their stratas. And in those discussions, we learned about some barriers that some strata owners and councils have been experiencing. We also asked each person if they had any tips for others. So the content for today's webinar came from people just like you in real life situations. So if you're here today, you might be feeling like this. Maybe you asked your strata council to install EV charging infrastructure, or maybe you requested permission to install a charger and you're not getting the answer that you want. Sometimes frustrations mount and you just feel like you're butting heads and nothing is happening. So in those interviews, there were a few themes that came out. And these are some of the remarks that people said that were, causing frustration in their stratas and their project. Things like council can't get with the times, or it's too expensive, there's higher priorities, it only benefits a few individuals. Some stratas were saying, well, no, we're waiting for new technology. Others said, well, we're too old, we don't care about EV charging. I'm sure you've heard that one. Others just felt their strata was short-sighted and that among the owners there was apathy and procrastination. So how do you get past this? Today we're going to be mythbusters and we're going to explore those perspectives and bust through them. We're also going to discuss the tips that we received from these strata owners. So the different roles and perspectives that we're going to look at today are the views from a strata council member, a property manager, owners and tenants who want to have EV charging, and the role of an EV champion. And we're going to try to find some common ground among these perspectives. So the first perspective is the strata council. And let's look at this from their point of view. And I love this slide because when you become a council member, you are suddenly hit with a lot of responsibilities and a lot of legislation to learn. So you sometimes feel like this. The big book of information overload just came in. I felt like that. If you've been a council member, I bet you felt like that too. So from a council member's point of view, what is your strata council dealing with? And put yourself in their shoes. I'm going to appeal to you today. I bet there's some people here today who at some point in your life have been in sales. And whether you're selling real estate or cars or insurance or whatever, it helps to get to know your customer. Sometimes that takes a bit of research. And it's also necessary if you want people to buy into an idea, even if you're not selling a product. So I'm going to ask you, have you attended council meetings and AGMs? Do you really know what the day-to-day is like for your council members? So here's a comment that came out of one of the interviews. And this is the full quote from this person. Keeping building systems in good working order and the inherent costs associated with that, not to mention all the other legislative requirements of the Strata Property Act, EV charging is not the highest on the list of priorities. They said, if it were easy and less expensive to install even one charging station, it might be worth exploring further. However, there's enough work these days just running day-to-day council needs. So I don't say this as an excuse, I just say it as getting into the person's shoes. So I want you to ask yourself, what's going on in your strata? And in the interviews, we heard a lot of the same kinds of stories and challenges and the types of emergencies that stratas are dealing with day to day, just balancing priorities. And some of these made a lot of sense. And there are things that are probably happening in your strata too. Are you dealing with leaky elements in your building envelope? Do you have a failing parking membrane? It's a very big, expensive project. Many people actually mentioned their aging elevators, which kind of makes sense with the building stock we have in BC and how it's aging. A lot of stratas were dealing with those day-to-day noise complaints and other bylaw complaints. Very, very time consuming for them to go through that enforcement process. We all have our buzzword, pinhole leaks. So there are lots and lots of water leaks. And if you've ever been through an insurance claim, it is long, it is tedious, and it's really stressful. There are, of course, also budget constraints. If you've ever had to hire somebody in the last 2 years, you'll know that finding contractors and tradespersons is really difficult, very challenging. So a lot of councils are just struggling to find contractors and service providers just to get through their day-to-day. With everything the council's dealing with, I want council members, if there's any here, to keep EV charging on your priority list. We're going to go through some facts. So fact one, in BC, we have the Zero Emissions Vehicle Act, and it legislates that all new light duty vehicle sales will be zero emission vehicles, that's electric vehicles, by 2035. That's not really that far away. The government of Canada has also set a mandatory target for all new light duty cars and passenger truck sales to be zero emission by the same year. So that means that in 2035, if you go to buy a car, there won't be any gas fueled engine cars. There's only going to be electric vehicles or perhaps other innovations in the field. So fact number two, it's about demand. BC has the highest EV adoption rate in North America. So when we look at the rebates and incentives that are out there that are continuing this trend, recently, even more rebates came along. So British Columbians can now save as much as $9,000 on the purchase or lease of a new EV. And it's income-based, this rebate, but still 90% of BC residents are eligible for that rebate. And with the price of gas, it's very attractive. And the BC government took one step further in 2022, and they took away the provincial sales tax. They said until 2027, used EV sales in BC are PST exempt. Fact number three, and this is a big one for strata corporations. In 2020, the premier at the time gave a mandate to the minister responsible for housing. That mandate includes a directive to bring right to charge legislation to enable more installation of EV charging in stratas and apartment buildings. It's been 2 years, that legislation hasn't come yet, but the fact is it's coming. So as a strata, it is practical for you to think of that and say, well, if it's going to come and we're going to have to provide it, why aren't we looking at it now? And many of the people I interviewed made these arguments. They emphasized that the rebates are available now, that BC is continuing to put more and more money into these programs. And a big one for strata owners, which is maintaining property value. We've all seen that most new buildings have these amenities, and you just want to keep up. So that was something that almost every person in an interview who had been successful in a project mentioned property value. Now we're going to move on to the perspective of a strata property manager. So I want you to be realistic. Your property manager may be able to help, but your contract with the management company doesn't include every task. So it's always a good idea to check the contract to see what services are included in the contract. And I think what you'll see is that their role is generally administrative. These days, there's a severe shortage of strata property managers, and they simply don't have time to do research, keep up with rebate programs, keep up with technology. And they also can't be expected to have the knowledge and expertise of engineers, electricians, project managers. While some of their other strata properties might have installed EV charging equipment, every strata is different. And by that, I mean that the building design, the age of the building, physical characteristics of the property. Do you have an open parking lot? Do you have underground? Do you have multiple buildings? And also the legal designations on your strata plan. There are many, many factors that all combine to make each strata unique. So what worked in another strata might not actually be helpful to your strata. So now the one that you're probably here for today is the perspective of an owner or a tenant. All you want to do is charge your electric vehicle, and you're frustrated that nothing is happening and you don't know what to do. So from the interviews, we compiled a number of tips. One of them was, before you buy your electric vehicle, have a charging plan, a backup plan for if your strata doesn't already have charging facilities. Have a plan of 1 to 2 years. It could be a local mall, library, community center, whatever's convenient for you, but have that plan, because you can't expect your strata to be providing EV charging facilities overnight. It's just, it's not practical. The other thing is, don't expect to get permission to use a 120 volt outlet in your parking garage. It's not unreasonable for the Strata Council to say no. That outlet is almost certainly not on a dedicated breaker. There could be many other things on that breaker, like lights, life safety systems, other outlets, and you don't know what other people are using those other outlets for. So is there a danger of overloading a circuit? Depending on the circumstances, it might be reasonable for your council to deny use of an outlet in the interest of safety, or at least until the owners can have a vote on a bylaw or rule that regulates the use of outlets in your parking garage. So sometimes residents forget that councils have to follow the law and the bylaws. And if there aren't bylaws yet about EV charging, councils don't have a guide to tell them what they're allowed to approve. So I want you to be patient and be respectful. EV charging in a strata involves many steps. Approvals take time. Any of you who've been up through a project, whether it's replacing a roof or fixing a foundation or putting in windows or anything, you know that approvals take time and projects take time. And just remember, it's council's job to act in the best interests of all owners. So here I'm going to challenge you to do your homework. Put in the time, get to know your own strata. Read those AGM and council meeting minutes to get up to date of what is actually going on in my strata. You may not be aware. Maybe a study has already been done to assess the electrical capacity. I've talked to people in the interviews who didn't realize that there were already some bylaws and rules about EV charging because they hadn't bothered to read the bylaws. Another really important part of the bylaws is reading the bylaws about alterations, which is requests for alterations, the process, the conditions that might be imposed on approving that alteration. Really, really important part of the bylaws when you're looking at making a request for something like this. The other thing is, what are you actually requesting? What is your goal? Think about this. Decide what you're asking for. Are you asking the strata to consider infrastructure for all residents, just for yourself? Maybe you were thinking of a charging station that owners can share. But when you're thinking about that, think about the future, because parking stalls can be made EV ready. And what that means is that all the infrastructure is installed up to the point of a parking stall, which is then ready for the connection of an EV charging station to be installed. So I'm not going to go into a whole explanation of what EV ready means. We've already done a webinar on that. In fact, we've done several webinars that break down the 3 main steps of getting EV ready. So you can pretty much learn everything you need to know about all of those 3 rebates and 3 steps by watching those 3 videos. It's only an hour and a half of your time, and it will actually save you hours and hours of research of just surfing the web. So the first video is EV ready plans for condominium stratas. You'll learn all about those and the rebate. The next one is called EV electrical infrastructure rebates for condominium stratas. And the third one is called EV charging stations, because there's also rebates for those. Then, to really summarize the whole process in about a 3-minute read, we've put together an infographic. Now, this is designed specifically for strata corporations, because it sort of breaks down, when do you need to have those information meetings? What is the order of applying for rebates versus having AGMs for approvals? That sort of thing. And you can get this on our website. I can put the link in after the webinar. So again, look back at your goals. What if your goal is just to get a few charging stations or a station that residents can share? Even one charging station needs electrical infrastructure. So that EV ready plan is a great way to understand the options for your building. Even if you are never planning to have stations for every single person, it's a great piece of information. And I kind of compare it to your depreciation report. If you lived in a strata before 2013, we were just trying to keep up with maintenance on our own. We didn't have a guide. And an EV ready plan is kind of like that. It's a third-party professional written document that is giving you the information you need to sort of go into your projects eyes wide open and make good decisions, understanding what infrastructure you already have and what your options are going forward. So I want you to think, where is this station going to be located? And there's some legal research to do for this. Check the strata plan and the bylaws. In some of the interviews, I learned that people didn't understand the legal designations of the parking stalls on their strata plan. And in one case, they could have saved thousands of dollars if they'd taken time to learn it. They pretty much, I'll simplify it to the fact that they ran conduit much further than they needed to if they had just understood that they could have, in their case, reassigned the park. So the big question, of course, when you're thinking about requesting or when council is thinking about approving a request is who pays. So this is a big challenge in convincing people to get on board with the idea of EV charging. And it's a good practice early in your research and planning to carefully consider what bylaws and rules might work for your owners. I'm not talking about drafting the exact wording. I'm just talking about thinking about those ideas and concepts of how that might work. Your strata owners are going to have a much better experience, and you're going to reduce conflict if you really think these things out. So things like who pays for the actual charging station, who owns it, who maintains it, who gets insurance for it. It's a really good idea to think about the idea that you should have an indemnity agreement in this process. One of the interviews I did, the first 4 people weren't asked for an indemnity agreement. There was actually no legal basis for them to have to pay $1. They did pay for it, but they didn't have to because there was no legal agreement for them to do it. And so the 5th person came along and they were told they needed an indemnity agreement and all this stuff. So in their view, in their strata, that created conflict because there wasn't a fair, consistent process between all of the owners. A user agreement is really important too, because it's not always the same owner who is using that parking stall. Sometimes it's a tenant, sometimes it's the next owner. So that user agreement is basically for every single vehicle that will be using the charging stations. You also have to really think carefully about the method that you're going to use for the ongoing operating expenses. What I'm finding from the interviews is people aren't thinking about that until after the infrastructure has been installed, when in fact it should be early in the process. Before you even decide what system you want, you should be asking the questions about what costs are going to come from this on an annual basis from using this particular proprietor's system. And for fairness and for transparency and having your owners understand, they are more likely to approve a project if they understand if those costs are going to be recouped and how those costs are going to be calculated and recouped. So you can see that there's a lot of research that you could do and that I recommend before you even submit your request to your council. Again, what is your goal? Be really clear about what you're requesting and take the time to put it in a formal letter. It is not reasonable or respectful to your council to send an email with 20 attachments expecting them to decipher your request. These are busy people. They've got a lot on their plate. If you're going to ask them to give approval and create conditions and send you a letter of approval, do the same at the beginning and make a formal request. The next thing I'm going to say is don't be discouraged or get upset if your first attempt isn't approved. We all don't like to hear no, but usually there's a reason, and it doesn't mean that there won't be approval in the future. It usually means that there's a piece of information missing. So why was the request denied? What information does council still need? And what are the barriers? Maybe there is a barrier with your electrical capacity in the building, or maybe there's no information yet about what that capacity is. You might be able to adjust your plan and resubmit your request, and you might be successful. So just be patient and keep trying to see if there's another way to make that happen. So the last perspective we're going to look at is probably one of the most inspiring ones. It's about being an EV champion. And the importance of an EV champion came up a lot in the interviews. This is a person who is passionate about the project and willing to put in a significant amount of time and effort to see it through. This is a quote from someone who I would call an EV champion, with their suggestions for building support. And I'm going to read it out because I think it's really important. I'd recommend that strata owners who are hoping for EV options in their strata spend considerable time educating owners on the process, on the benefits and the challenges of EV infrastructure. Strata councils are far less likely to undermine such an initiative the more broad-based the support is from the owners. I found a lot of inspiration from that person's comment. And I thought about what are the best practices to work cooperatively with your council from day one. And there is a simple process for council to give a person or a committee of persons the authority to do something. And the first step in that process is to make a written request for a hearing. And that's something that's under the Strata Property Act. And I don't want you to be put off by the word hearing. All it is a chance to talk to council. So at a council meeting, you would have maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes to talk to council about your idea. And then it's probably a good idea to then also give your written information or request or letter so that they have it also in writing. And make a request to be that EV champion or form a committee. Maybe you have a few different people who are willing to put in the time and help. But what's really important in this process is to define what you want that committee to be able to do. And there are times when councils and owners, they seem to agree on something, but what exactly did they agree to? Did anyone write it down? Have people forgotten? A year later, are people going to remember the details of that agreement? Maybe some people on the committee have changed and didn't actually realize what the agreement was all about. So I'm going to get into just a little bit of the law here. Many strata corporations use the standard bylaws, or they have bylaws that are similar to the standard bylaws. So there's one called Standard Bylaw 20. This one allows a council to delegate certain powers and duties to one or more persons. Now, it's usually for a specific purpose, for a limited time, and council can revoke that delegation at any time. These decisions are made by a majority vote of council at a council meeting, and the decision is documented in the minutes. So again, here is that delegation in writing. Everybody can find it, everybody can refer to it. The owners understand also who's been delegated to do what. So that could mean something like council gives the authority to the person or the committee to contact electrical contractors, get quotes on behalf of the strata. It could be, they could limit those powers and duties by saying committee is not authorized to sign documents or enter into contracts or to spend any money. They might require the committee to attend council meetings, provide reports. So this is a really, really important step to avoid misunderstandings. And one of the ways that things can go sideways is when an EV champion or any committee is working on a project and there's not clear boundaries. So I'd written down some of the legal stuff and now it's gone. So there is something called implied consent. And I had the definition here and it's disappeared. But basically what that means is that there's been an assumption by somebody of what they're allowed to do through somebody's actions. It's been implied, it's been inferred, and that can cause problems. So for example, if somebody is working with a contractor, the contractor doesn't know what authority that person has been given by the council. There could technically be contractual disputes with that contractor if they thought they were entering into a verbal contract or a written contract because they thought that person had authorization. So you really want to avoid implied consent and make sure everything is written down, everybody's clear, and refer back to that permission from time to time to remind everybody what that scope of permission looks like. The other thing, now this may seem obvious, but the other thing that that came up in the interviews was just the attitude and the presentation of your ideas. Be positive and helpful. One thing people said is stick to the facts. Saying that you want EV charging isn't going to fly. It's not going to convince people. But if you stick to the facts, you're more likely to get support. So we want you to be considerate and respectful and really, really listen to people's concerns. One of the, and again, this might seem obvious, but one of the things that came up as a theme is, just dealing with people who are demanding or rude or pushy and sometimes even threatening. So this goes back to who's making the pitch, who's the salesman or salesperson. And I heard a couple of stories here where they said, we realized the wrong person was pitching the idea. And another thing that came up was, who is the person that's pitching? Is this somebody that the owners know? Too often in a strata, you find someone, they've lived in the strata for 6 years, they've never been to an AGM, they've never been to a council meeting, and all of a sudden they're coming to council and they're demanding something. And everybody's thinking, who is this person? They've never cared about anything in the strata before. And now they want us to spend all this money on a project. Why would we even listen to this person? So sometimes if you're the EV champion, maybe you want to find someone else who believes in your project, who is the better person to pitch the idea. So as you know, in a strata, we deal with a lot of people, a lot of personalities. So this is just something that came out of the interviews that I thought was really interesting. And again, it's all about selling an idea. So we talked about what the permission might be from a council for that committee, that EV champion, to have the authority to do. And here's a whole list of things they can do that don't cost anything. So for example, gathering information like the strata plan and the bylaws, You can ask for copies of those from your property manager or your council. Checking eligibility for rebates. I showed you those videos that you can watch on our website. We have a link to the CleanBC program guide. Maybe you read 3 pages to find out what the eligibility is for those rebates. You can also contact BC Hydro and get peak load data for your Strata corporation. You do have to have authority to sign that document to make that request, but the information itself is free. Might take a little while for BC Hydro to get you that data, but that's pretty neat. You can get information and it won't cost you a penny. You can also do research on contractors. And here's where talking to other stratas can be really helpful, is to find out what contractors did they work with. There's also CleanBC has a great list of questions that you can ask your contractor, but really they're the questions that you probably already know from working on other projects. You know, how many other stratas has this particular contractor worked for? How many EV ready plans have they written? How many projects have they done that are large, that have given charging to every stall? What are their qualifications? Can they give you references that you can contact? These are a lot of the same things that happen when we do big projects like replacing a roof or whatever. So they're pretty common sense, but it does make sense because not every electrical contractor has experience in this field. It's been a very fast changing, emerging field for technology experience, new regulations from Technical Safety BC, changes in the electrical code. So not every electrician has experience in this area. And talking to other stratas, you might find some recommendations. It's also no charge to ask them for a quote for the EV Ready plan. And then with council's cooperation, you could also survey owners, ask them, when are you planning to buy an electric vehicle? Or, you know, do you have a timeline? Are you not interested in the modal? And keep in mind that you're going to have some residents who don't have a car at all. So it is actually really interesting to get a survey done, but it's not necessarily the first thing you do. You can see that there was a lot of research you can do first, and I really recommend doing some of that research first before you do your survey with owners. And now we get back to what that EV champion said about how important it is to educate the ownership itself, and that you're more likely to show council that there's support for something if there's more owners who are on board. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's true. So again, in the interviews, people said stick to the facts and the statistics. So some of the things that we talked about earlier today about all those reasons why EV charging is important in stratas and why we should be thinking about it now. And the benefits, also the future needs. You might have one person interested in EV charging now, but you saw with the uptake of electric vehicles in BC that the future needs are going to come really fast. 2035 is not far away. We all know people who have ordered their electric vehicles who are just waiting for them to arrive. Cost of gas, that alone is enough to push the demand. So we're going to see a flood of strata owners who suddenly have electric vehicles, and we have to think about that. A couple of people in the interviews said, do the cost analysis. We're not going to get into the details today, but there are new rebates from the ministry that handles low carbon fuels. And those are very, very attractive. And we've been talking to that ministry about delivering a webinar specifically for strata owners, and we will get into that, but there is a cost benefit there, and there are rebates as well to put in your infrastructure. So it's really, really interesting to look at that cost analysis because it's very attractive. The other thing that you can do to educate owners is just share those VISOA videos. People can watch them on their own time, but if they watch those, they'll realize it's not a big scary thing. There's, you know, there are steps involved, but it can be done. You may want to do some presentations. You could ask your council, hey, can we organize an information meeting or call it a town hall? But really listen to concerns. And when people have concerns, even if you don't think they're that important, research a good answer, make sure they feel heard, and get them that information and follow up. So listen to their concerns, research that, and again, try to give them facts And at the very beginning of this webinar, we talked about some of the myths people have. They're still going to have those misconceptions and misinformation. So just try to be patient and dispel that misinformation. Another thing that the EV champion or committee can help with is planning the annual general meeting or special general meeting where you'll be talking about this and trying to get some approvals. So you might, as a champion, try to arrange a presentation or a guest speaker, which can be very effective. You might also help them get information that can be put in the notice package, even if it's just a short paragraph to explain or summarize what your goal is for your strata. And some of the resolutions that you can think about for that very first AGM or SGM is getting funding for the EV Ready plan. They are not expensive, and with the current rebate of up to 75%, max 3,000, it actually works out in most stratas to only be about 1,000 to 3,000 to do your EV Ready plan for the net cost. It is not a lot of money. So getting that money approved is not always as difficult as you think. You might want to also have a resolution to get some money for a few legal costs, because then you're going to have that help and support through the next parts of the process. You could possibly put in resolutions about amending bylaws or rules, or a part of the act called changing the significant change of use. Those might come a little bit later, but it just gives you the idea of the types of things that need to be approved. And all of the things in this list require a 3/4 vote under the current legislation. So here's our EV champion. He's celebrating. See it through. Some of the people I interviewed said, commit to 1 to 3 years. It's not a short time. And be prepared that the council members change every year, or could change every year. So you're always going to be educating some new council members. But some of the things that the EV champions did, and I really have to commend them for the time commitment that they put in, is they were often the liaison with the engineers and contractors. Again, make sure you have permission to do that, and that it's really, really clear from your council what you're allowed to do. And provide lots of updates to council and the owners. And just be prepared to answer the same questions over and over and over throughout the entire time. 1 to 3 years, you're going to be sounding like a broken record, but not everybody shows up to the information meeting. So you're constantly going to have the same questions come up. So if you want to learn more, I'll just mention the CleanBC EV Charger program is administered by BC Hydro and FortisBC. We do have links to information on the program guide on our website about their rebates. Their program also offers the support of an EV charging advisor. So if you are a strata council or a property manager, you can contact them. You can also visit our website. We have an entire page dedicated to information for strata corporations. Or you can contact us at evcharging@visoa.bc.ca. Finally, we are very grateful to the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation for some financial support they've given us to put on our EV charging webinar series. So thank you for attending today's webinar. You can watch our videos on our channel. It's called VISOA videos, or you can just search VISOA on YouTube.